civilizations of Mesoamerica as we move into what is sometimes called the Classical Age. The general scheme for talking about ancient Mexico, or Mesoamerica more broadly, is to outline a pre-classic culture, so the Olmecs and related peoples from about 1600 BC to about 200 AD. This is when a lot of the main patterns of later civilizations would be developed. This is followed by the Classic period, where in particular the Mayans and their city-states in the Yucatan become highly developed before the Maya collapse. There's also further north, close to the Valley of Mexico, but not in it, Teotihuacan, and possibly its empire, while in Oaxaca, the Zapotecs from Montealban become a major player as well. Anyway, so you can see, this is really the key period for the Mayans. And the Mayan city-states are in Mayapan, the land of the Mayans. This is the most central part of Mesoamerica. Southern Mexico, all of Guatemala and Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador, where the Mayan people live and live down to the present. In the north are the lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula, and the land gradually gets more mountainous as you go southward, come out of the jungle, going into the mountains, mountainous highlands of Chiapas and Guatemala, and then on the southwest side, the Pacific coastal lowlands, which are much more narrow than those on the Caribbean side. The name Maya is very much a modern name, and it's only really begun to be used by Mayan peoples in the last century, because they never really had a single collective identity. There are multiple Mayan languages, and there has never been a unified Mayan state. Some of the things that you will see in Mayan culture come from the Olmecs, but really get their finest development in the Mayan cities, such as pyramids. The step pyramids of Mexico and Central America are almost always meant as temples. On top of the pyramid is the holy place where rituals will be done. In Mayan, they are called Ka'na, which means the house of gods, or the house of the god. And sometimes they are built to commemorate ancestors, but even then, the ancestors are worshipped in the temple. None of them are nearly as tall, anywhere near as tall as the pyramids in Egypt. However, the largest standing pyramid is in Mexico. It is not a Mayan pyramid. And there are a lot of them. And if you travel around some of the Mayan lands, you will occasionally just see a small pyramid on the side of the road, where someone had put up a temple long ago. So there are probably hundreds, if not thousands. New ones are discovered constantly. In general, in a lot of the Mayan lands, new discoveries are made quite frequently because it is so thickly forested that when sites are abandoned, they very quickly become completely overgrown then become lost. Now, the Mayans build cities, and their cities are kind of interesting looking. They do not look like cities in the old world in Africa, Europe, and Asia. They are much more spread out. They have core areas where you have pyramids and other ceremonial centers would seem to be government offices. You would have palaces, the pyramid temples, ball courts, and sometimes astronomical observatories. And around this, over a very large area, there are the areas where people live in sort of satellite communities. And in some ways, it looks maybe more like Atlanta than when we think of an ancient city. So if there are a couple of 100,000 people living in a Mayan city, they are spread out over a much larger area than, say, a Greek or Roman city of similar size. The different parts of the city are usually linked together by causeways, so you can get easily from one part to the next. One of the largest is the city of Tikal, which is in the rainforest in northern Guatemala. This is what it looks like today. Another major city is Palenque, which is just at the foot of the mountains in Chiapas state in Mexico. It's really quite a neat place. When I was there, it was extremely humid, though not incredibly hot. Chichen Itza, which is also in Mexico, is deep in the jungles, and it looks something like this. If I remember correctly, the final scene in the first Star Wars film is filmed here. Now, there are other cities, and there are about 100 of these cities, the largest being several 100,000 people, and then going down to much, much smaller scale. Many of them seem to have had kings, and the kings would have been basically divine figures, like viewed as gods on earth. They have priestly functions. They communicate between the people and the gods. From what we know, it seems like kings usually went father to son, normally the eldest son, and as well as a priest, the king was expected to be the leader of the people in war. General Mayan politics are dominated, as best we can tell, by the royal families and their nobility. How it would have worked in each kingdom would have varied from one city to the next. But generally, the royalty sort of keep themselves somewhat apart and above the ordinary people. You could definitely see parallels to this, to ancient Egypt or other early societies. Do you know something of how the kings would have lived in their palaces? This is the palace in Palenque. Generally, the palaces were on raised stone platforms on which the palace itself would have been built. This sort of makes sense when you think about the fact that a lot of these areas are pretty thin. So being up makes sense. They have various structures on top and some stone features like benches and thrones, things like that that survive, though most of the furnishings are long since gone. Some of them have running water and other water supplies set up. They have sweat rooms for sweat baths. And sometimes the old kings were buried underneath the palaces of the current kings. The throne rooms where the king will be, a new king is inaugurated, are visible in a couple of these. The kings of these different cities have been fighting each other constantly. Sometimes they fight with the intention of destroying the other cities. Uh, there are lots of images like this one of kings with the heads of their enemies. Sometimes they're shown with the heads of their enemies hanging from their belts. If a king is not killed and beheaded, he loses and is captured. He will be taken back to the city that defeated him and be taken to the temples where he would be tortured and sacrificed to the gods. Because torture is something that has a place in Mayan religious ritual. The weapons they used, look similar to things used elsewhere. The Mayans do not have metal weapons. Their weapons are made from stone. And so for things like spears and swords, they use sharp, extremely sharp obsidian, um, black volcanic stone to work as sort of like razors along wooden shafts. So you have these things called the macalahilito, which is a wooden sword with obsidian blades, but otherwise would be used like a sword in battle. The warriors, we know something of how they looked and dressed, often wearing feathered garments for decoration, carrying shields, bows and arrows, and these stone-tipped weapons. They're armored. Um, their armor is made of cotton clothing that is then padded and soaked in salt water and then layered. According to Spanish conquistadors who saw this quilted armor when it was still being used, it was nearly as effective in preventing injury as the metal armor that the Spanish would, while being lighter and not quite as terrible to wear in a hot, humid climate. Now, around year 900, the Mayan cities, which have been flourishing for 700 years, hit what is called the Mayan collapse. And there are a lot of different theories as to what caused this. Were there invasions from outside? Was there some sort of climate catastrophe? What, a plague? What happened? And what does seem to have happened is places like Palenque, Tikal, Chichen Itza, the largest of the Mayan cities in the southern lowlands, are all abandoned, and the population collapses in that area. However, Mayan cities in the north of the Yucatan Peninsula, Chichen Itza is in the north, so it continues on, as well as the Mayans in the highlands south continue to do well. The Mayan cities in the north will survive as independent kingdoms right up until the time of the Spanish conquest. The same with the highland Mayans. And both groups are very much still active. It's only in the southern Yucatan that you have this collapse. However, whatever had happened. And Mayan languages are probably the first or second most widely spoken Native American languages today. Um, there are very large Mayan communities in Mexico and Guatemala that still have a Mayan identity, a lot of them practicing traditional religion right down to the present. Now, while the Mayans are having their rise and fall, to the north, there is a city called Teotihuacan. It's about 25 miles south from Mexico City in the same region of mountains and valleys in central Mexico. And it was one of the largest cities in the world in its time, and absolutely the largest city in the Americas, having a population of at least 250,000. It grew rich because Teotihuacan is the main source of obsidian for the other cultures of Mesoamerica. And since they're not in a jungle environment, a lot of the evidence of their society has survived in much better condition. This city would have consisted of lots of very large multifamily apartment residential areas. They would have been painted bright colors, looking something like this at their high point. The houses, buildings had painted walls. And there is a large central avenue leading between the pyramids of the sun and of the moon. Here's some of the murals from Teotihuacan, giving an idea of what some of the interiors would have looked like. Now, the pyramids of the sun and the moon are the third and fourth largest pyramids in the world today. Of course, the Great Pyramid in Egypt being the largest, and are step pyramid temples like those Mayan lands. They're in very good shape. You can walk up them if you go there. Apparently, one of the biggest threats to them is parking at the neighboring Walmart. Not a joke. This city, Teotihuacan, seems to have had flourished for about 800 years. And there's the interesting thing that in 378, we know that people from Teotihuacan go down into the Mayan land and conquer the city of Tikal, the largest of the Mayan cities. They will also conquer other Mayan cities, and we know this from Mayan inscriptions from those cities. Some of them are, well, the man from Teotihuacan arrives and becomes the king on the same day that the former king drops dead, suggesting that perhaps he conquered it. And there's a little bit of evidence. I mean, it's not clear, but it seems like Teotihuacan was the seat of an empire that would have controlled much of southern Mexico and down into Guatemala. This is, again, one of those that is only slowly sort of being worked out today. But just like what happens in the Mayan land, Teotihuacan also is abandoned. And it seems like around 750, there was an invasion and the city was burned. It then becomes abandoned as a major site. However, the region around it remains very important right down to the present. And there's pretty good guess that the people who invaded were probably the people called the Toltecs. We'll come to them in the next unit. Now, elsewhere in Mexico, while the Mayans the people of Teotihuacan are flourishing. There are other civilizations flourishing, like that of the Zapotecs. The main center for the Zapotecs is on top of a mountain called Monte Alban, which is right next to the modern city of Oaxaca. And this city would have been at its peak about 35,000 people. It also is abandoned right around the year 700. This is one of those frustrating things where it seems like something big happens in many areas of Mesoamerica right around this time, causing cities to be abandoned, but we just don't know enough. And all of these civilizations, the Zapotecs and the Mayans, continue on. Teotihuacan seems to be transformed into the Toltec civilization, but we just don't know enough, or at least I don't know enough. And we'll continue this in the next year. Thank you.